Howdy friends, congrats on making it through another year, and as a reward for all your hard work and seeing as we're in that vague period in January where I usually make a video about PS1 fan translations, I've decided to make yet another video about PS1 fan translations. Who could have seen this coming? That's right, we're going to take a look at all the English fan translations that made it to the PlayStation in the year 2024. We've got giant ladies, small ladies, exploding heads, and even a little car you can drive around in. Seriously, slap some jazz fusion over that bad boy, and we're in flavor country. So sit back, relax, and get yourself comfy as we dive into some of the most interesting and bizarre games the PlayStation has to offer. And oh yeah, Goemon is here too. Everybody loves Goemon. So, as always, before we dig into the games, just a quick disclaimer to let you know the 10 games we'll be looking at today are all English language translations and should be playable on both original hardware and via emulation, assuming you've got the means to do either. This isn't meant to be a full review or breakdown of these games and their patches, more so just a brief introduction to let you know what the game is all about, that it exists, and that it is ready to play in English right now. So if you like what you see, well, you know what to do. And as per usual, we'll be looking at our 10 games today in alphabetical order, which means we'll be kicking things off with one of my personal favorites from this year's lineup, and I have a feeling it might be one of yours too, assuming you love trash. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Ancient Roman Power of Darkside, a game that from the moment I first saw it in action, it was like love at first sight, and that was before you hear the music, which really just seals the deal. This right here is pure grade A Kosoge in every conceivable way, and this is why I always love a snowy Aria project. A lot of people out there when choosing a project to translate will prioritize the classics, the big obvious games that people want to see translated, but for as much as I love those projects, I think it's also important to have people out there catering to the freaks, and Ancient Roman is a game for the freaks. A turn-based role-playing game so janky, so rough around the edges, and with music so ear-piercingly bad that it almost comes off like a parody done on purpose. But nope, this right here was a real, honest-to-God attempt at making a game that could compete with Final Fantasy VII, a game that came out a whole year earlier than this one. Now, on the surface, the core mechanics and gameplay of Ancient Roman are what you'd expect. It's your standard turn-based RPG after all. Random battles, towns, boss fights, treasure chests, all that good stuff. It's just the process of doing all that stuff is plagued with weird moments between the incredibly laggy menus, attack animations that pause between each hit, and really odd pacing. I swear I spent like an hour visiting 3 different towns in a row before even entering an area that had any combat. Also, the visuals here are just something else, be it the pre-rendered exploration segments, the 3D showcase that is the battles, and above all else there's the music, which I think even if you could overlook all the game's other quirks, the music here is so staggeringly bad and almost antagonistic to the player that it never lets you forget you're playing something truly special. Naturally, the game kind of gained infamy in its home country and is often considered the worst role-playing game on the PlayStation. And look, when you consider the amount of role-playing games on the PlayStation, and that includes the entire Japanese library, that's a pretty tough accolade to earn. You can kind of think of it as like the PS1 RPG equivalent to Death Crimson on the Saturn. Well, maybe not as infamous as Death Crimson, but I have seen videos of people playing this game's music live on YouTube, so it's certainly got its fans.
talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing.
In fact, one of the most interesting things about the music is that it wasn't supposed to sound like this. I mean, let's be fair, no composer would be paid to write music like this on purpose, right? But as it turns out, the soundtrack to this game came out on CD either before or very close to the game's original release. And yeah, listen to how the music sounds on that CD.
手が鳴るぜ。
So yeah, as it turns out, in the process of converting the music from the MIDI files to the PS1 sound chip, something went terribly wrong and all the music just got fucked up in the process. I don't know how this made it to print and wasn't spotted beforehand, but suffice to say, it is one of the funnier fuck-ups in gaming history, and of course it would be this game where it had to happen. But yeah, I do actually feel pretty bad for the composer because compositionally, there are some good tunes here, it's just tunes with all the wrong notes playing. Although I will give a shout out to the map theme because despite all of this game's issues, it still managed to come out sounding pretty good, so that's a minor victory at least. So, Ancient Roman, clearly a pretty terrible game, but I think it's one of those bad games that is so endearingly bad that it kind of works its way around to being likable, despite its flaws. It's like The Room. If you watch that knowing and expecting it to be bad, it's very funny. And if you play Ancient Roman going in knowing what to expect, it is very funny. And sometimes that's all you're looking for in a game. Even the characters are quite likable, which is more than I can say for a lot of games. And Snowy even translated the drama CD that was released alongside the game. So yeah, Ancient Roman fans have never had it better, or worse, depending on who you ask. I mean, seriously, that music is really something else. Following on from the other two Goemon games we've featured in these videos, which were pretty fun, we now have the third Goemon game to see a translation on the PlayStation, and that's Ganbare Goemon Ooedo Daikaiten, a game that kind of plays like a greatest hits of the older Goemon games, specifically the second Super Famicom game, which is also where most of the music is from. Although funnily the story of this game is all about recycling, so at least the humor here is on point. You know, every time I play a Goemon title, I always wonder why I haven't played more Goemon games. They're such a fun time. Old school 2D Konami platforming action, tough but fair boss battles, fun little exploration segments, light RPG elements, a girl with a bazooka, and you've even got mech battles, something Konami really loved adding to their platformers back in the day. And look, who could blame them? You've got 4 playable characters, each with their own abilities that you can use throughout the levels, and you can even swap characters on the fly. And like many Goemon games, you've also got 2-player co-op as well. It's just a good old classic 2D platformer with some cute visuals and excellent music. And after playing Ancient Roman, let me tell you, the music here just sounded that little bit sweeter than usual.
パンチ俺はゴージャスインパクト
So, once again, another fun Goemon game, now available in English. Maybe 2025 is the year I finally start diving into the series properly. I mean, it's got a very hardcore and dedicated fan base, and usually that's a sign a game is good. And who knows, maybe by the time I catch up on the series, the fourth and final PS1 Goemon game might also see a translation. I hear that one's kinda bad, but hey, I never stopped anybody before, am I right? Next up, we have a game eagerly awaited by many, including myself. It's Germs: The Targeted Town, a game that not only has some of the strangest box art of all time, but also a game where you drive your little car through a very grey low-poly city. And thanks to this translation, I can now do a whole bunch of other stuff too, and it's somehow even weirder than I expected it to be. Now before we start, I believe there was an announcement of a patch for this game a few years ago, but this patch from Grundo is unaffiliated with that original project, and this is actually based on the Spanish translation for Germs, which originally came from Mr. Nobody, somebody whose work has also appeared in these videos quite a bit, so shout out to them. You see, a lot of Japanese games receive translation patches in other languages before they appear in English. I believe PS1 Baroque was translated into Spanish before it was ever released in English, and even recently the cool Fist of the North Star beat 'em up got translated into Italian, which we love to see, because for every game that gets translated into one language, it becomes easier for it again to be translated into another language and vice versa. Every patch is progress, you know? Now, in this case, I've read that some folks have had issues with the quality of this translation and the fact that it was done from Japanese to Spanish to English, but honestly, I thought it was pretty good regardless. There are some issues with the text alignment and getting the space to actually fit the whole English script onto the disc, which is something folks are still working on sorting out, because it turns out hacking these things is often quite difficult, but the whole game is completely playable like this. The translation and menus make sense, and it has clearly had some effort put into it. Like, I know we're pretty spoiled with the quality and polish of fan translations these days, but I don't expect everything to be a professional level production. I mean, depending on the game, I'm more than happy simply being able to navigate the menus and just understand how to play the game. And look, if you're not personally happy with aspects of a patch, you're always free to wait for another one, do it yourself, or just not play it, you know? I mean, nobody is forcing you to. At the end of the day, none of us own these games, and the people who probably do own the rights to them likely don't even know that they do, so people are free to make and release what they like for them. And while I still hope the other planned patch for this game sees the light of day and improves upon things here, because let's be fair, we all want these games to get the full 5-star treatment if they can, I just think that's an unrealistic expectation to put on people, when in a lot of cases folks just want to be able to simply play the game. And in this case, Grundo just wanted to be able to play Germs in English, and because of that, I can now play Germs in English. And as it turns out, I love Germs. An open world, first person, body horror mystery role-playing game, and easily one of the most bizarre games on the PlayStation. From the visual style and environmental design to the story, characters, and weird-ass gameplay, this is simultaneously one of the jankiest and most ambitious games on the console. Sure, the visuals might be a little bit limited to some of you, but the scope of this thing is crazy for a PS1 game. Like, this is a proper town you can drive around in, and it also has a fully functioning subway system that you can ride on stop by stop. There's tons of NPCs you can interact with and get clues from, and the whole game has a pretty non-linear flow to everything. Essentially, you play as a reporter that's investigating some strange going-ons in the city, and from the beginning you kind of just choose your own path. I mean, I could have followed the police orders and headed to a nearby hotel due to some strange goings on, or I could visit my very unstable friend who wants us to attack a nuclear plant with C4 for some reason. I'm not gonna lie, it all escalated pretty fast, especially when I started killing seemingly innocent plant workers and dogs at the nuclear plant. But yeah, it turns out he might have been onto something with this whole power plant thing. I mean, stuff got really weird, and I mean very weird. Once again, this isn't really a game you should go into expecting highly polished visuals or gameplay, but it's without a doubt a trip unlike any other on the console, and another fine example of the ambitious and highly experimental games that you can find in the depths of this console's library, and something that I would recommend everybody give a try at least once, even if it's just to drive your tiny car around an eerily grey low poly town, which I've got to tell you, is pretty fucking incredible. You know what else is pretty fucking incredible? Linda Cube got a fan translation finally after all these years. And yes, it is Linda Cube and not Linda Linda Linda, although that is a pretty great song.
Linda, Linda, Linda,
So for those unaware, Lyn the Cube was a turn-based role-playing game originally released on the PC Engine CD-ROM in 1995. It was designed by Shoji Masuda, who was the designer of a little game called Tengai Makio 2, which was also released on the PC Engine CD and has the accolade of being the very best-selling PC Engine game of them all. And after making a very well-received and traditional role-playing game, a few years later we were given, let's just say, a very untraditional role-playing game, one that later received enhanced ports to the PlayStation in 97 and the Saturn in 98, and this PS1 version, titled Lyn the Cube again, is the first to appear in English. Lyn the Cube is a game that I wished I knew nothing about before playing it, because sadly I thought this game was very unlikely to be translated, and I read through the plot one day a few years ago, and look, once you experience the plot of this game, you will not soon forget it, but for now I'll just try to explain the basics to you. Lyn the Cube takes place on the fictional planet of Neo Kenya, Japan once again proving you can make any place sound cooler by adding the word Neo in front of it. But unfortunately, despite sounding pretty cool, Neo Kenya is sadly awaiting its inevitable destruction thanks to a big ol' asteroid in the sky. But one day out of nowhere, God, or at least a god, hits you out of nowhere with the whole Noah's Ark shtick and sends a big space ark alongside some commandments down to Neo Kenya and requests that a man and woman work together to round up 2 of every animal and then blast off into space before the asteroid destroys everything, which should happen in about 8 years' time. And yeah, that's pretty much the goal of this game. You gotta wander around and quite literally round up 2 of every animal via turn-based battles and general exploration, all while an in-game timer counts down towards the end of the world. It's like Bible games meets Pokemon meets Monster Hunter, but I assure you it's a whole lot more than that. I mean, why does the Ark seem alive? Why do all the animals look like that? Who's to say, really? But the big gimmick of this game, besides all its other cool little gimmicks, of which there are many, is that you have 3 different scenarios to play through, which are all kind of remixes of the same story. You can play them in any order, but generally it's recommended that you play through them in the set order just to get the intended experience. Now, I won't say much more other than that, but what I will say is that this is one of the funniest, strangest, horrifying, and most human role-playing games I've ever played, and there really isn't anything else quite like it. Also, you can collect dogs and use them in your party, which is fun, and I gotta tell you, I got very emotionally attached and protective of my dogs. I mean, I could care less about a Pokemon, but a tiny pixel dog that I have to take to the vet when it's low on HP, that shit makes me feel something, man. Next up, we have the first of 2 Hilltop projects in 2024, and that's Mini Moni, Shaker, and Tambourine Dapyon, which is exactly what it looks like. Samba de Amigo, but with tambourines. Seriously, it even has a whole plastic tambourine setup. It's absolutely wild. And while that is pretty interesting in and of itself, possibly the most interesting thing about this game is that it's the only game Sega made for the PS1, and it's also a PS1 console exclusive as well. Well, technically there are 2 Sega games released on the PS1 since the 2003 reissue of Puyo Puyo Sun was published by Sega, but like, if you thought seeing Sega's logo on PS2 and GameCube games back in the day was crazy, it's even crazier that they made a game for the original PlayStation, and it's Tambourine Samba de Amigo, of all things. So a little backstory, Shakato Tambourine was originally released in the arcades and built on the Naomi arcade hardware, and Sega and Sonic Team thought the best place to port this to was not the Dreamcast or any of the other 6th gen consoles, but instead to port it to the original PlayStation, and now also add the Japanese idol group Mini Moni to spice things up, which oddly enough is one of 3 different Mini Moni games to be released on the PlayStation. But hey, if you like cute naughty's J-pop, the more the better, right? Honestly, you'll probably know immediately if this is the type of game for you. Now, I'm personally a big fan of Samba de Amigo, and while the gameplay here is more or less the same, I wouldn't say I'm the biggest J-pop idol guy, so Samba would still be my preferred variant. But even so, the music and visuals here are pretty fun for what it is, and it also plays quite well even without the tambourine controller, utilizing the analog sticks quite well both in the rhythm and minigame portions of this title. Overall, it's a cute little game with a decent number of tracks, and it also has that excellent level of polish you would expect from a Hilltop project, and frankly, it's just kind of cool to have the lone Sega PS1 project out there available for more to experience. So whether you're a Tambourine fan or just like interesting pieces of gaming history, Mini Moni, Shaker, and Tambourine is well worth checking out. Hey look, it's PoPoLoCrois Monogatari II, back again with a brand new patch. Well, an update to a previous patch that you might remember from, I don't know, a few videos ago. Who the hell watches this shit? So just to bring you up to speed, PoPoLoCrois is a series of role-playing games from Sony based on a popular Japanese manga of the same name. It's often considered one of Sony's strongest series on the console, at least in Japan anyway, where the series was quite big, often being considered as Sony's own version of Dragon Quest. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, the series, outside of a few very limited releases, never made it over to the West. Now, the good news is that the first PS1 game has been fully translated for a little while now, and while the second game has been fully playable for a couple of years now with the menus and quest dialogue all translated, the NPC dialogue in this older version of the patch was machine translated, and unfortunately for a game like PoPoLoCrois where the NPC dialogue is one of the highlights in my opinion, that really isn't ideal. But lo and behold, nearly 2 years later, the complete and final version of this patch is now out there and the game is fully translated into English for the first time, and damn, is it good. They even translated the manual too, and as a noted manual fan, oh, we love to see it. Now, one of the problems with doing a video like this, especially one that is heavily role-playing game centric, is that I have to play these games for a little while to capture a nice variety of footage, and after a few hours, I end up inevitably getting sucked into the thing and just want to beat the whole game. And my god, PoPoLoCrois 2 is just so goddamn charming. It's full of beautiful, colorful 2D visuals with possibly the most emotive sprites that I've seen on the console. Like, the amount of unique animations for scenes in this thing is kind of incredible, and the dialogue here is also really witty and funny too. Top that off with a fun, engaging, and surprisingly tactical battle system, one that doesn't hold your hand, as well as some top-tier voice acting and PS1 era role-playing game music, and you've got yourself a game that almost certainly would have been considered one of the top dogs of the PlayStation's RPG library had it been released in the West. But look, thanks to this patch, now you can experience it and judge for yourself. Although, just a heads up, there is also a spin-off / side story released in between the first and second game called PoPoLoCrois, which is also currently being translated. So if you want to wait to experience the series in full, you can always hold off for that if you like. But either way, if you enjoy yourself the old 2D fantasy turn-based role-playing game, you are doing yourself a disservice not trying this series. It really is some lovely stuff. Next up, we have an interesting series of translations that I actually missed out on last year because they appeared on Twitter instead of any of the usual places I check for these things, which just goes to show you there could be a whole bunch of translations out there that we don't even know about, just hidden away on the internet, or not so hidden in this case, but hey, at least I got there in the end. That's right, it's a partial translation for all 6 of the Rockman Complete Works entries on the PS1, which, if you don't know, are PlayStation ports of the original 6 Rockman games, with a few cool extras, enhancements, and some Pocket Station support as well. I made a big long video about Capcom games on the PS1 that talks about these a bit more in depth, but long story short, they're pretty good. What these patches do is translate the in-game menus for all 6 of the games, and there's a pretty large chunk of menus and options in these things too, so the patches are certainly quite useful. Although unfortunately, as of right now, this translation doesn't cover the in-game cutscenes, Navi mode dialogue, or the Pocket Station content, and also a selection of the gallery content, which look to be a bit more difficult to hack. But having played all these games in Japanese previously, there's no doubt these patches do make the games a whole lot easier to navigate if you don't speak the language. And look, once you've actually gotten into the games themselves, it's just Mega Man. You can probably tell what's going on anyway, you know, just jump and shoot, you'll probably be fine. Hopefully these patches might see a complete 1.0 release down the line, but in the meantime, a nice series of patches for Rockman fans who also happened to get another pretty cool patch last year. Hey look, it's more Rockman, and this time he's in 3D and has some really cool hair. That's right, it's Rockman-2 Episode 1, a translation of the Japan-exclusive demo for Mega Man Legends 2 that was included alongside the Japanese retail release of Misadventures of Tron Bonne. And this demo is not only a nice introduction to the gameplay and world of Mega Man Legends 2, but it also features a bunch of exclusive content only ever seen on this disc. And look, if you know Mega Man Legends fans, those people are starved for content, so seeing this demo finally get translated is definitely a nice little treat. Once again, I talked talked about both this demo and Mega Man Legends 2 in my very long Capcom video, which you can check out if you want to know a bit more about the series and its gameplay. But once again, long story short, they are very good and you should definitely try them. In fact, this demo here is honestly a perfect way to dip your toes into the series without having too much of a time investment. I mean, it gives you 4 different playable segments that each give you a different taste of the gameplay style seen in the game, from the overworld segments to dungeon crawling and even big boss fights, all bolstered by the game's slick gameplay and frankly stunning visuals. It really is the perfect taster for this game, and I imagine a lot of folks who play it will walk away very impressed by how enjoyable this thing is. And better still, the patch even includes some bonus developer exclusive content that you can now experience for the first time, and believe me, it's an experience. So what else can I say? Another top tier, incredibly polished Hilltop release. And while Hilltop has been busy working some magic over on other consoles the past few years, I'm still very appreciative that they pop in and give the PlayStation some love on occasion. You might even say I love to see it, and you know what? I really do. A game I was very pleasantly surprised to see drop on my birthday this year, which also happens to be the PlayStation's 30th anniversary, which, let's be fair, is a little bit more important, was a patch for Welcome House 2, Keaton and his uncle. You might remember the original Welcome House from last year's video, a game that is effectively Resident Evil, but instead of zombies and combat, you've got a weird uncle who owns a big mansion and has too much money, and he likes playing pranks on you. Surprisingly, the game was a lot of fun. It's basically a video game version of an old cartoon, and as a noted Tom and Jerry, Itchy and Scratchy and Worker and Parasite fan, it was most certainly right up my alley. The only issue, however, is that the patch for the first game used a ChatGPT translation, which was playable, but well, it was what you'd expect. But this new translation for Welcome House 2 from Chapu is human translated and does not use ChatGPT at all, and as a result is a whole lot more coherent. So shout out to Chapu. Welcome House 2 is about as direct a follow-up as you can get. From the gameplay to the mansion you wander around in, it's all the same. The only difference is that the last game took place on April Fool's Day, while Welcome House 2 takes place on Independence Day, which is a good excuse for your uncle to renovate all the rooms in the house and set up a whole new series of traps for you to overcome. And the fun part is that you never really overcome them, you just get partially more injured as the game progresses. They even got a dog with a drinking problem this time around, and believe me, he gets pretty mean. I don't think it will be a game for everybody due to its slower pace and grid-based movement, but if you like adventure games, puzzles, and old school slapstick animation, I think this is a very enjoyable way to kill an hour or two. And look, I've always got time for Welcome House, be it with a good translation or a wonky ChatGPT variant. And now it's time for our final patch of the video, and that's the PS1 port of Wizardry 7 Crusaders of the Dark Savant, which unsurprisingly is the 7th mainline game in the much loved and revered Wizardry series of role-playing games. Now, we briefly talked about Wizardry in the last fan translation video when discussing the PS1 port of Ultima Underworld, which, surprise surprise, was also translated by Guardia here. So if you're an old school role-playing game fan and also a fan of weird PS1 versions of old role-playing games, Guardia has been doing some heavy lifting for you guys, let me tell you. Now, Wizardry 7 is a game that has been available in English since its launch all the way back in the early 90s, well, on computers anyway, but as we all know, due to the popularity of Western role-playing games in Japan and the country's preference for console gaming, a lot of these PC role-playing games would find their way to consoles, often exclusive to Japan, and usually with a few tweaks to better suit the console's controller limitations. But sometimes in the case of a game like Ultima Underworld, you might even get a complete console remake with entirely new visuals and controls, pretty much making it a whole new game. And while the PS1 version of Wizardry 7 here isn't quite at the level of the Ultima Underworld port, it is still a very interesting and very visually distinct version of this classic game, featuring new 3D backgrounds, redrawn characters and portraits, and a whole bunch of juicy early 90s CGI, which I gotta say, I'm a huge fan of.
He searches for the great secret, the Astral Domina, and he has already obtained the part of the key to its mystery. Aboard the ship of the Dark Savant is a young girl by the name of V. Domina. Within her lies a special connection to the Astral Domina, and though she knows it not, it is through her that the power may be won. There are also others. The T rang.
Now, the thing with Wizardry is that it's a very old school, complex, lengthy, unforgiving, and deep role-playing game, for better and for worse. And this 7 entry is at the point where the game goes a bit more sci-fi than fantasy, which is actually pretty cool, I think. But if you haven't played the other games, in particular the 6th game leading up to this, you might be a little bit lost. So I don't think this PS1 port of 7, for as interesting as it is, would be the best introduction to the series. Also, it is legitimately quite cumbersome to play, even if the PS1 control scheme is about as good as it could be considering. But even still, playing this myself and struggling through some of the meaner aspects of this game, like beating a tough boss and then immediately drowning afterwards by walking into a small pool of water, you can still definitely sense the appeal in a game like this. And you know, considering the series' influence on pretty much the entire Japanese role-playing scene, I think you owe it to yourself to check out a Wizardry game at least once, even if the PS1 port of 7 feels like it's more for series diehards looking to check out a unique version of a beloved classic. There are plenty more modern versions of Wizardry out there that would probably serve as better entries to the series, and I've even heard very good things about the recent mobile Wizardry game called Wizardry Variants Daphne, and despite it being a free-to-play game with gacha elements, I've even heard noted gacha haters and Wizardry fans praise this thing, and believe me, they're pretty hard to impress, so that's gotta count for something. Now, I would have played this game myself and given you more of a breakdown on it, but I'm unfortunately too much of a normie and still addicted to Pokemon trading card Pocket, so hey, what can you do? Anyway, that's all the patches that came to the PS1 last year that I'm aware of anyway, but there is one more translation that didn't appear on the PS1, but it is a PS1 game, so we might as well check it out. That's right, one of the most infamous and expensive PlayStation games out there received a pretty cool translation in 2024, and in multiple different languages too, only instead of being on the PlayStation, the game has instead been rebuilt to operate from a web browser, where the game is now fully playable and even runs better than the PS1 original, and to be honest, for a series like Lain, that is quite fitting. And look, while I'd personally like to see the patch implemented into the PS1 game itself so it was playable on real hardware, I'm not 100% sure if that's doable on the PS1 version, but regardless, it is cool just to see this game out there and available for more people to enjoy. For those unaware, the PS1 Lain game is kind of a companion to the anime, and being able to experience both allows you to appreciate the other one more. A lot of the game itself revolves around you navigating through a fictional OS, listening to audio logs and watching short clips, so it is effectively a very fancy visual novel with a lot of cool stuff for fans of cyber and old school web aesthetics. Now the thing is, the game is already mostly in English, with the menus and OS being in English by default, but the meat of this game, the audio logs, are all in Japanese, and this is where the translation comes into play, adding subtitles for all the voice logs, which unsurprisingly is a game changer. And while there has been translations of these voice logs in text form for a very long time now, clearly adding the subtitles to the PS1 game itself is either impossible or just very, very difficult. And in this case, straight up building a new version of the game might have been needed to facilitate this translation at all. And look, if any fan base was capable of pulling off something like that, I'm not surprised it's Lain fans, let's just put it that way. Anyway, that's been a look at all the translations that made it to the PS1 in 2024. Another fine year, especially if you're a role-playing game fan. I mean, it is definitely nice that we have Lyn the Cube finally, but the cultural impact of having ancient Roman in English is gonna send waves throughout the world, let me tell you. What does 2025 have in store for us though? Well, plenty of cool stuff I expect. I hear rumblings of a Kowloon's Gate and Moonlight Syndrome translation, which would be pretty exciting on both accounts. As for myself, other than still lighting a candle daily in the hopes of a Sega Gaga patch, the top of my PS1 list is currently Brightest, which I covered in my most recent Japan-only PS1 games video and really enjoyed. So if we could all pool our energy together and manifest a translation of that thing, I'd really appreciate it. But how about yourselves? What translation would you guys like to see in the future? Let me know in the comments, and if your wish comes true, you can return later and boast about your wonderful and incredible powers of premonition. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all the talented people out there helping to make these games available to a wider audience, no matter the language and no matter the platform. Thank you for giving up your time to contribute to the hobby we all love so dearly. You are the real ones. And speaking of real ones, I gotta give a shout out to my lovely and generous Patreon supporters for making videos like this possible, including fine folks like Alan Caslin, Alias McDo, Bloody Cassie, Callow Mello, Clumbums, Danny, Dave Nolan, Disc Kun, the mascot for the Famicom Disk System, Doma, Etchy Gamer, Fragile Traveler, Globe99, Hogfather D23, Ice Light, Jared Bynum, Johnbo81, Karurun, Kyle Winter, Life Sword, Mr. Papala, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshman, Ms. Cat, My Pal Robot, Nathan McMullen, Nick Norman, Richard Kramer, Cyeno, Spectre117, and Tolcotto, who have all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. And finally, I'd like to give one final shout out to you at home or wherever you are for watching this video. I sure do hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back in the hopefully not too distant future with some more PS1 goodness. I am hoping to make 2025 a particularly productive year for myself. Only time will tell, but until next time, take it easy, look after yourselves, and I'll talk to you again real soon. See ya!